Forget everything you thought you knew about antiquity. We're about to expose a side of ancient history that's been buried for centuries. The forgotten world of elaborate pranks and comedic deceptions. Prepare to be astounded by the sheer ingenuity of history's original tricksters, proving laughter was just as powerful as war. Now, breathe in, relax, and let the curtain rise on the great unmasking. Ancient Greek literature is full of outsized pranksters, wily gods who love to mess with mortals, sly servants who get their own back on arrogant aristocrats, and philosophical poseurs who make fools of conventional morality. And we can see all kinds of trickery in the surviving Greek literature. But we're also told about clever jokes, funny stories, and amusing wordplay. So let's take a quick tour through some of history's greatest ancient pranksters. Philogelos, the oldest joke book. One of the great things about studying classics is that occasionally something surprising turns up. Scholars are always making new discoveries, whether it's an inscription carved into a potsherd or a lost play found in a box of old books. But one of my favorite finds was stumbling across a little-known manuscript that might just be the oldest joke book in the world. It was published in 1912, so it's not like it's a fresh discovery, but most people aren't going to have heard about it. It's called the Philogelos, which means lover of laughter. And what we have is a tiny scroll that survives in 2 fragments. This little papyrus contains 34 short jokes or jests. They're meant to be spoken aloud, and many of them are clearly designed to provoke laughter with clever wordplay. Some of them are more like mini anecdotes, like the story about the full-dressed woman who walks into a bathhouse and asks for a cold water sponge. When someone asks why she's dressed like that, she replies, "I want to buy my sweat." And when the slave says, "You can't do that," she retorts, "Then sell me a cold bath." This kind of joke works by subverting expectations and playing with the double meanings of words. And it's not very different from modern puns or malapropisms. But it's amazing to see these little bits of business written down. The papyrus was discovered at Herculaneum, the Roman town that was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius along with Pompeii. We think it comes from a pocketbook of jests that someone had with them when they died. It dates to late antiquity, sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE. And although it's a Christian era piece, it has echoes of older Greek traditions. For example, there's a joke about a bald man looking for his cap in a graveyard, and that's clearly modeled on a famous story about a foolish old man from the Greek poet Avienus, which goes back to the 4th century BCE. So these jokes are like mini performances, little bursts of verbal energy designed to catch people off guard and provoke laughter. Just imagine overhearing them being told in a tavern, market square, or symposium. These jokes would have been told and retold, and they show us just how much the Greeks loved their playful disorder. Performance is trickery. When we think of ancient Greek literature, we usually think of big set pieces like the Iliad or the Odyssey, big tragedies or philosophical treatises. But scattered throughout the literature are vivid portraits of colorful characters. These brief character sketches are often funny, sometimes mean-spirited, but they're always incisive character studies. One of my favorites is the portrait of the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who was born around 400 BCE and died around 323 BC. Diogenes is first mentioned by the Greek philosopher Plato in his Protagoras dialogue. He's introduced as a friend of his, and he appears alongside other historical figures like the generals Chares and Brasidas. But despite the fact that he's portrayed as a respected Athenian citizen in Plato's work, we know him today mostly through a series of anecdotes collected by the Greek biographer and essayist Diogenes Laertius. And these stories paint a completely different picture. Diogenes is a notorious prankster, a man who delights in unsettling respectable Athenians. He's famous for living in a large jar, which he uses to annoy and shock passers-by. He acts as if he's crazy, or even a little dim-witted. He's also famous for walking around Athens during the day with a lamp looking for an honest man. The idea here is that honesty is so rare that it's as rare as something to be seen by daylight. In another story, he brings a wreath of ivy to the theater, hoping to be admitted free. And when he's told to piss off, he says, "All right, I'll vote against you next time you're put up for public office." That last story has a political edge to it because it mocks the way politicians court popular favor. In another story, Diogenes parodies the standard Greek religious practice of throwing dust in the air to invoke the gods by theatrically throwing sand on his head and proclaiming, "Hey Zeus, this guy pissed me off." And then he throws dust on the person who wrote the law that he's referring to. He was a master of getting under people's skin, puncturing social norms, and forcing people to laugh at themselves. Even the way Diogenes behaves in philosophical discussions is treated as a joke. He was apparently fond of saying, "I agree to everything," which frustrated those who wanted to debate him. He's also famous for his paradoxical pronouncements, like poverty is not what you think it is. And when someone asked what he meant by that, he replied, "If only you were poor like me, you wouldn't have to say that." These stories about Diogenes are obviously later than his lifetime, and they probably circulated for centuries before they were written down. They're clearly legendary, and that means we can't know what actually happened. But the stories do tell us something about how people thought about humor, about ethics, and about how they liked to poke fun at respected conventions. Not a prank, but almost. The great thing about studying classics is that it's such a broad field. You really get to study everything from epic poetry to philosophy, drama, comedy, history, letters, visual art, archaeology, and the list goes on. And that means you get to explore lots of different genres. For example, I'm reading Homer's Iliad and Odyssey this year, so I've been thinking a lot about epic poetry. I've talked about those poems on this channel a few times, but I'm also interested in related stuff like Homeric hymns and Homeric epics. And while I'm reading, I'm trying to get better at writing creative nonfiction that blends scholarship with good storytelling. The Trojan Horse. Any list of great tricks would have to include the Trojan Horse. Now, this story doesn't fit neatly into our model of a prank because it's anything but childish. And yet, it does feel like a prank on the part of the Greeks. The story comes to us from the epic traditions surrounding the Trojan War. According to that tradition, the Greeks laid siege to the city of Troy, but the Trojans proved to be stubborn opponents. So the Greek hero Odysseus hit on a daring plan. He told the rest of the Greeks to build a large wooden horse and inscribe "Nevermore" on its side. Then he left the horse outside the city walls as if it was an offering to the goddess Athena. The next morning, the Trojans came out to find it, and they dragged the horse inside the city, right into the citadel. As the celebrants were parading around the horse, Odysseus and his men emerged from their hiding places and slaughtered the defenseless Trojans. Now, to be fair, this isn't exactly a prank. The entire plan is a ruse, and it ends in bloodshed. And it's more of a civic-level trick rather than something an individual might pull. But the story does have elements of a joke. The Greeks hid themselves inside a giant sculpture. They tricked the Trojans into bringing it inside their city. And the whole affair ended with the unsuspecting hosts being humiliated and killed. It's almost like the Greeks pulled a fast one over on the Trojans, and then they laughed as they looted the city. It's hard to tell exactly what Homer, the poet who recounted this story, thought was funny, but we can see how such a tale appealed to his audience's sense of theatrical deception, of the hubris of those who get taken in by appearances, and of the dark possibilities of public gullibility. From pocket jokes and street philosophers, we now move into festivals and civic rituals places where the rules were inverted and mighty communities celebrated laughter as a kind of sanctioned mischief. It's not all that surprising that we have memories of ancient Greek and Roman comedy surviving through the ages. The ancient people loved to laugh, to mock, and to jest. And in this episode of History's Funniest People, we'll be looking at some of the most elaborate pranksters in antiquity. Before we begin, A quick reminder to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting us. Now let's get started. Saturnalia and festival inversions. As the Romans approached the end of their long, dark winter, they knew that spring was just around the corner. But before the vernal equinox could arrive, they had one last major festival to endure, Saturnalia, the celebration of the agricultural god Saturn. This festival, which took place from December until the 2nd of January, was the biggest holiday in the Roman calendar. For 5 days, Rome turned upside down. Slaves were temporarily freed from their bonds and allowed to gamble. Masters dressed up as hairy barbarians and served their servants elaborate meals. A small price to pay for an endless supply of funny games and mischief. During this time, citizens would dress as hairy barbarians and storm the city, banging drums and generally causing a ruckus. Everyone wore garlands on their heads and carried sticks with green branches attached to them. This was a holiday where everyone could become a little more boisterous than normal. Joking, drinking, and merrymaking went hand in hand with the ritual. Slaves and servants were even given the right to mock their betters during this holiday season. You couldn't get roasted for roasting someone else. It was a season of good cheer and irreverent fun. But Saturnalia wasn't the only Roman festival where social roles were reversed. There were many other celebrations where the Romans delighted in inverting the social order. One might think that the whole point of these festivals was to let off some steam, to show that even the Stoic Romans had a sense of humor. Aristophanes and theatrical practical jokes. If you want to know how truly irreverent the Greeks could be, you need look no further than the plays of Aristophanes. We know very little about the playwright's life, but what we do know is that he wrote close to 40 comedies for the city Dionysia festival held in Athens between 487 and 406 BCE. Of those 40 or so plays, only 11 have survived to modern times. But they are enough to paint a picture of a man who was willing to push the limits of Athenian society and make fun of pretty much anyone, including the great generals of the Delian League. In one of his most famous plays, Women at the Thesmophoria, Aristophanes envisions a world where women take over the male-dominated political system. After the women decide to withhold sex from the men of Athens, the men are forced to send an envoy to retrieve them. One of the main characters is Masilicus, a man who dresses up as a woman to infiltrate the Thesmophoria, the sacred festival where Athenian women gathered to worship Demeter and her daughter Persephone. Masilicus accidentally drinks some magic potion meant for the chorus of women and becomes pregnant. Aristophanes clearly delights in confounding the audience's expectations of gender roles. His plays were a form of practical joke taken to the level of high art. They weren't just jokes, but carefully crafted pieces of social commentary. He poked fun at Cleon, a notoriously disliked politician, so much so that Cleon had him put on trial for his satirical attacks. Although Aristophanes won the case, the playwright probably realized that he had to be careful about whom he made fun of. Still, it seems that the great comic playwright understood something about human nature that has remained true throughout history. People love to laugh at those in power, especially when they're having a bad day. The play of the goat. What would you do if a satyr broke into your house and stole your wife? If you're an ancient Greek, the answer might be nothing. That's because satyrs were half goat, half human creatures associated with wine, revelry, and most importantly, misrule. In other words, they were tricksters. And the Greeks knew that if satyrs were allowed to run wild, things were liable to get messy. So they put on plays featuring these goat-legged monsters so that the satyrs could burn off their pranking energy in a controlled environment. The satyr plays were part of the rural Dionysia, a smaller version of the city Dionysia festival held in Athens. Unlike the tragedies and comedies of the city Dionysia, very little of the satyr plays have survived to the modern day. However, from the evidence at hand, it seems clear that satyr plays featured a lot of crude humor, phallic symbols, and general merriment. Sometimes the satyr plays were performed as part of a procession that would go house to house during the festival. The actors would wear masks and carry leafy branches, and they would delight in confusing the townspeople. If you opened your door and saw a satyr standing there, holding a leafy branch, you would probably scream and slam the door in his face. But if you opened the door and saw a band of satyrs with torches, you would probably offer them wine and ask them to come in and tell you a story. After all, what kind of monster doesn't like a nice drink and a good story? Since the satyr plays were performed outdoors, the actors had to wear masks. These masks were big, colorful, and often grotesque. They helped the actors project their voices, and they also helped them get into character. By wearing a mask, an actor could become someone else, someone with a different personality, someone who could do things that the actor himself could not do. This was a concept that the Greeks would later develop into the tragic and comedic masks that we see in Greek theater today. One of the most famous satyr plays, Acarnania by Ibycus, tells the story of a princess who is kidnapped by a giant. The princess is saved by a hero, but when the hero goes to claim his reward, the king tricks him and locks him in a bronze chamber. Just as the hero is about to give up hope, a band of satyrs breaks into the chamber and scares the king. The king runs away and the hero is set free. By the 4th century BCE, satyr plays were no longer performed as part of the city Dionysia. Instead, they were performed separately as a kind of entertainment for adults. They were still popular with the audiences, but the authorities decided that the crude humor and ribaldry was getting out of hand. By the Hellenistic period, the satyr plays were completely forgotten, but they left their mark on Roman comedy, which was full of body humor and practical jokes. Thanks to the ancient Romans' fondness for Greek culture, satyr plays were revived in the 1st century BCE. They were performed during the Saturnalia, the Roman festival of misrule, where anything could happen and social norms were turned on their head. During the Saturnalia, slaves could beat their masters, and no one could stop them. Women could participate in public rituals, and men could dress up as women and vice versa. The Saturnalia was a time for people to let loose and have fun, and the satyr plays were the perfect entertainment for the holiday. In the Middle Ages, European Christians tried to stamp out pagan holidays like Saturnalia, but they couldn't completely stop them. Saturnalia evolved into Christmas and other winter festivals, and the tradition of performing satyr plays during holidays lives on in the form of pantomimes and other kinds of masked performances. Do you know any obscure ancient history facts? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of History's Funniest People. So you liked your pranks elaborate, your cons complex. You are not alone. People have been playing elaborate pranks since before recorded history, and some of them got real nasty. In this episode, we are taking a look at history's most elaborate ancient pranksters. Part 1. Royal and Civic Hoaxes. A well-placed rumor could ruin an ambitious politician's career. An outrageous stunt could make a king look ridiculous in front of his entire kingdom. And occasionally, someone would try to kill them. That last one was a little too far, but it was hard to know where to draw the line in a time without television. Modern audiences might dismiss public stunts as mere publicity, but ancient pranksters considered how their jape would play out in the court of public opinion. They crafted elaborate hoaxes that humiliated targets, undermined rivals, or made innocents look divine. Though often nameless, these mischief makers were experts at working the crowd and manipulating the news. Pranksters had plenty of opportunities to humiliate unsuspecting rulers, especially those who cultivated an image of godlike perfection. The Greeks took great pleasure in stories of gods and demigods displaying their power through spectacular, even miraculous feats. But mortals were also expected to perform small miracles to maintain their public image. One infamous example is the pseudo-miracle attributed to the Roman Emperor Nero. It comes to us via the Roman historian Suetonius, who reports that Nero was so vain, he frequently tried to appear in public doing something miraculous. Suetonius writes that once, while walking near the Tiber River, Nero pretended to pull a drowning man from the water, and another time, he had someone drop a golden crown into a fountain to be pulled out by his fishing rod. It was a subtle art, managing to look spontaneous while ensuring people saw your amazing feat, and none understood it better than the emperor. But not everyone was fooled, like the Greek satirist Juvenal, who parodied Nero's miracle fishing in a scathing poem about the emperor's conspicuous consumption. Pranksters didn't always need a ruler as their target. In ancient Rome, anyone could become the victim of civic theater, including the famous Roman general and statesman Cicero. He was the victim of an elaborate prank played by members of the rival populist party. While traveling to Greece in 63 BCE, Cicero learned that someone had replaced the bronze statue of his deceased brother with a waxen imitation. This wasn't just a mean joke. The wax model was meant to cast doubt on Cicero's relationship with his brother and insinuate that he had somehow profited from his untimely death. Not only did the prank damage Cicero's reputation, it threatened his political career. It was part of an orchestrated campaign to smear him during his run for consul. Cicero's rival used every tool available to them to attack him, including rumor, innuendo, and waxwork doppelgangers. In response, Cicero wrote a letter to Atticus, a friend who was staying in Rome. He asked him to find out who was responsible for the prank and demanded retribution. Cicero wrote, "I want you to find out who did this and what else is being done in my absence. And I beg you, do not let the matter drop." In the end, it seems that Cicero never found out who was behind the caper, but it didn't stop him from winning his consulship the following year. The Greeks took great pleasure in stories of gods and demigods, displaying their power through spectacular, even miraculous feats. But mortals were also expected to perform small miracles to maintain their public image. One infamous example is the pseudo-miracle attributed to the Roman Emperor Nero. It comes to us via the Roman historian Suetonius, who reports that Nero was so vain, he frequently tried to appear in public doing something miraculous. Suetonius writes that once while walking near the Tiber River, Nero pretended to pull a drowning man from the water, and another time, he had someone drop a golden crown into a fountain to be pulled out by his fishing rod. It was a subtle art, managing to look spontaneous while ensuring people saw your amazing feat, and none understood it better than the emperor. But not everyone was fooled, like the Greek satirist Juvenal, who parodied Nero's miracle fishing in a scathing poem about the emperor's conspicuous consumption. Sometimes, though, the target of a prank wanted to play along. When Athens hosted the Panathenaic Games in 570 BCE, the citizens of the nearby island of Chios decided to send a delegation to see the festivities. According to a charming anecdote relayed by the Athenian historian Thucydides, the Chians wanted to impress the Athenians with a grand procession, but they were having trouble deciding on a symbol to lead the march. When they finally settled on an owl, a sacred bird in Athena's iconography, the Chians quickly realized they didn't have a live specimen to sacrifice. No problem. Someone produced a wooden owl effigy, which the Chians paraded around the city until they reached the entrance to the Panathenaic procession. Then they sent the effigy back home, relieved that they had met their quota for civic duty. But the jig was up. When the wooden bird appeared again in the next procession, the spectators roared with laughter. Part 2. Religious Tricksters. Across the ancient world, temples and religious sites were both revered and ridiculed. Pranksters knew that high priests and oracles were especially susceptible to public humiliation, and few were more notorious than the Egyptian priestess Sibyl of Cumae. She is said to have scammed her way into immortality in the 1st century BCE after deceiving Augustus into believing she could grant him the gift of prophecy. Another Roman emperor, Caligula, had less patience for such tricks. The Sibyl of Tibur was known for delivering cryptic predictions, but nobody was sure if she was a fraud or a genuine seeress. When Caligula consulted her about his future, the Sibyl told him that he would become the father of 2 sons. This was a bad call because Caligula had no sons, and he responded by putting the Sibyl to death. Either way, her reputation was secure, and visitors continued to flock to her shrine. It seemed nothing could diminish her power, except maybe setting her sacred tortoise on fire. That's exactly what the Greek philosopher Pliny the Younger did during a visit to the shrine. Pliny tells the story himself in a letter to his friend Tacitus. Apparently, he knew the Sibyl had been cheating by hiding her tortoise under a cloak while pretending to receive divine inspiration. So he set fire to the cloak, forcing the old woman to flee. What happened to the tortoise? We don't know, but Pliny took satisfaction in destroying its mistress's charade. For more elaborate pranks and hilariously humiliating stunts, stay tuned for more information. And now back to our list. Religious tricksters often targeted deities directly. Across the ancient Mediterranean, there were numerous cults devoted to miracle-working gods and goddesses, but their powers could be challenged by skeptics and mockers. Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek writer, poked fun at popular religions with his witty satire. In one essay, he satirizes miracle workers who claim to speak with the Egyptian goddess Isis. He recounts the tale of a man named Therapon who consulted an Isis priestess for help with his failing eyesight. Instead of offering prayers, the priestess advised Therapon to buy new clothes, shoes, and a fine belt. She then proceeded to beat him with those items, saying that each blow was a prayer to Isis. Finally, she handed him a small box and told him to keep it close to him. Whenever he felt unwell, he should open it, touch his body with the contents, and recite a prayer. The box contained a scorpion and a lizard. Lucian pointed out that these creatures were hardly godly emissaries, and that the whole affair was nothing more than extortion disguised as a religious ritual. It was just one of many scams perpetrated by false oracles, fortune-tellers, and itinerant priests. And Lucian wasn't the only one to spot them. The ancient Greek playwright Euripides tackled the same subject in his play The Trojan Women, written around 415 BCE. The chorus warns that such false prophets are everywhere, and that it's wise to be cautious with strangers who claim to have special knowledge. Part 3. The Art of the Practical Joke. The proliferation of markets in ancient cities created fertile ground for practical jokes. After all, merchants depended on their customers' trust and goodwill to sell their wares. For many merchants, it was in their best interest to cultivate an air of mystery and even piety around their business. That's why it's not surprising that so many temples featured stalls selling charms, amulets, and other magic goods. It was a risky business, peddling fake miracles. Vendors needed to be clever and quick-witted, able to switch places with accomplices, leave town quickly, or even fake their own deaths. It was important to travel with a good reputation, but few travelers did more to build theirs than Alexander the Great. His tomb in Alexandria was an enormous structure filled with priceless treasures. It was a wonder of the ancient world and a pilgrimage site for centuries. But the tomb was also a money-making opportunity for vendors looking to capitalize on the crowds. Enter the purveyors of magical garlanded flowers. They sold wreaths and garlands that miraculously never wilted and could even be kept as souvenirs. The secret was simple. The garlands were fake, fashioned from beeswax and dyed linen. But the secret was hard to come by. It's one of the few ancient pranks that managed to outlive its inventor. Today, you can buy similar garlands at souvenir shops across Europe and North America. From the time of Alexander the Great until the fall of the Western Empire, merchants used fake merchandise to con unsuspecting customers. Often the most valuable items were the biggest